Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture. Tonight's lecture is the first of a new series called the International Lecture Series that the Royal Society has decided to start. And the goal is to invite leading scientists from all over the world to discuss their work or to give a talk about their work here. And it's a particular pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, the inaugural lecturer in the series, Professor Raghavendra Gadagkar from Bangalore in India. Professor Gadagkar is a professor in the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And he's established an active school of research in animal behavior and ecology and evolution in India. Now, Professor Gadagkar is also known to some of you because he was, until very recently, the president of the Indian National Science Academy, which is our sister academy in India. And he's a very distinguished scientist with several hundred articles as well as 2 books published by Harvard University Press, and has been the recipient of numerous awards, as well as being elected a foreign associate of the US National Academy of Sciences and of the German Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. I got to know Professor Gadagkar only a few years ago. I actually first read an article by him about how, people in India were often doing science that was sort of imitative or derivative, when there was actually a wealth of problems to study in India. And I thought this was something that I really agreed with, and I first wrote to him and said how much I enjoyed his article. Of course, his own work exemplifies that kind of originality and creativity. Later I found that he has a number of other interests. For example, he's interested in education, in the intersection between science and the humanities, how science and policy should interact, and so on. And no doubt these interests are partly the reason he agreed to serve as president of INSA. And finally, I should say, I heard Professor Gadagkar speak about his research again about 3 years ago, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. It was the first time I heard him speak. And it was quite an enthralling lecture. And if tonight's lecture is anything like that one, I can assure you you're in for a treat. So I'd like to welcome.
Thank you, Venki. Good evening. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here to inaugurate this new lecture series. Above all, it's a great opportunity to present to you some of the work that I and my students do in Bangalore. I have called this, Can We Understand an Insect Society and Why Should We Care? Very briefly, let me say a few words to introduce insect societies. Perhaps the one that is familiar to everyone is the honeybee. So the honeybee is a kind of major example of insect societies. As you know, honeybees live in large populous colonies. Each colony consists of a single large female individual, the queen, who is the only one who reproduces in the colony. Colonies may consist of small number of male bees, which are called drones. And the most famous thing about the drones is that they are lazy. They don't do any work. And all the work that is needed to be done to maintain and run the society is actually performed by these smaller sterile workers. They are sterile and they do all the work. They build the nest, they clean the nest, they feed the larvae, they guard the nest, they go out and bring food. So it's a fascinating system. This is a picture of the queen who is in the middle, and as you can see, the queen is surrounded by a group of workers. These workers we might paraphrase and say are on royal duty. they are actually taking care of the queen. They clean the queen, they lick the queen, they feed the queen. She's too busy to do any of these things. All the time she's feeding herself and producing eggs, and she can lay thousands of eggs per day. So that's really her job. Now, after working at home for about, in the first half of their lives, which is about 3 weeks, bees venture out in search of food. Their food is nectar and pollen, and they gather these, come back to the nest and store it, and then make honey and feed the larvae. Now, this is very impressive because honeybee workers do not reproduce themselves. They spend their whole lives working for the welfare of the colony, for the welfare of the queen and her offspring, and we use the term altruism to characterize this. But the altruism of honeybee workers is even more spectacular sort of from a human point of view. Not only do they spend their whole lives working for someone else, but they are instantly ready to commit suicide for the welfare of the colony. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of being stung by a bee, but if you have been, then you should realize that the bee actually gave her life in order to sting you. So when a bee stings someone, this is actually a picture of a volunteer allowing himself to be stung, and the bee actually inserts her sting into your body, and when she does that, she cannot withdraw it anymore because it has barbs pointing outwards. So she tries to withdraw it, her abdomen ruptures, and she leaves behind the sting, the poison gland, and part of her digestive system hanging on your body, and she flies away only to die within a few minutes. And this poison gland continues to pump venom into your body, and people have actually measured this for up to 60 seconds after the owner of the poison gland has flown away. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very efficient venom delivery mechanism, but it comes at the cost of the life of the worker bee. And one of the questions that biologists are interested in is, how does natural selection promote such self-sacrificial behavior? Now, bees are not the only insect societies. Ants are equally famous. In fact, there are about 15,000 species of ants, all of them highly social. And the ants seem to have done one thing beyond that of the honeybees. The individual worker ants who do different tasks actually have different shapes and sizes of their body. They are born to do a particular task. All of these are members of the same colony. Now, as you can imagine, this particular ant is very efficient at carrying small seeds and bringing them back home, a task at which this ant is not at all suitable. But this ant is suitable for being a soldier and for defending the line of ants which are bringing back food to the nest. There is this morphological specialization. In fact, ants present perhaps the most spectacular intra-species, intrasexual body dimorphism, and the record is held by a Malaysian ant, and this is actually the largest member of the colony, and this is the smallest member of the colony. It turns out that the largest member of the colony weighs 500 times the smallest member of the colony, and I always like to remind my audience that both of these are produced from the same genome. It's just the environment, it's just the food that makes the difference. Then, of course, we have the wasps, which are my favorite insect societies. Not all wasps are social, but those that are social are also called paper wasps. And the reason why they're called paper wasps is they build their nests not from wax as bees do, not from soil as termites do, or leaves as ants do, but indeed from paper. This is actually a paper envelope surrounding the nest, excuse me, leaving just a small opening for the foragers to fly in and out. And if you open this, you will actually see what I like to call a multi-storied apartment complex. So these are really different layers of paper comb, and this is where the ants rear their brood, the wasps rear their brood. Now you might wonder where they get paper from. They actually manufacture paper. And the process by which they manufacture paper is remarkably similar to the way we would manufacture paper. They scrape cellulose fibers from plants, chew it in their mandibles, add some chemicals, make it into a fine pulp, spread it into a thin layer, and dry it. And it is paper. You can actually write on it. Now, I and my students study this paper wasp. It's more convenient to study than this one because this is too big. This is very convenient. First of all, this paper wasp does not build an envelope around its nest. So it makes it very easy for us to observe everything. You can study all of these wasps, and the numbers are very small. 20, 30, 40, 50 would be a sort of typical colony where the whole range of social behaviors happen. So it's very easy to study this, and this is what we actually study. Now there is one other difference between this insect society and some of the more advanced insect societies. In the advanced insect societies, you have a morphologically differentiated queen who is born as a queen and who dies as a queen, and she cannot do anything else. The workers are born as workers and die as workers. They can never hope to become queens. But in this society, all the individuals look identical. They are morphologically completely identical. Even statistically, you cannot distinguish. But one of them, and only one of them, is the queen. And she's the only one who reproduces. But she can be overthrown by one of the workers who can become the next queen. So just presents us with a very interesting kind of society to study, and that's why I and my students have spent now very long time studying these wasps. I want to begin with the question in the title, can we really understand an insect society? This is part of a larger question, can humans really understand nature? At the very least, I think we should be very cautious, and I am very fond of this quotation by Heraclitus, who said, nature loves to hide. And Heraclitus gives us caution in our research, so that's one pillar of our research. But the English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon said, nature does not unveil its secrets except under the torture of experiments. And this gives us hope. So the second pillar of our research is hope. And the third pillar, as I hope to show you in the rest of this lecture, is passion. So there's caution, there's hope, and there's passion, which drives our research. Now, people often ask me, but why do you study them in the first place? Many people study insect societies for many different reasons, and my reasons are as follows. For the same reason that an anthropologist studies humans is my answer. Anthropologists can offer us a glimpse into the lives and mores of primitive and exotic human societies. Biologists can do much more. They can offer us insights from a whole range of animal societies with millions of years of evolutionary history. And those of us who study insect societies can hope to harness wisdom, wisdom is the operative word here, from an altogether different sub-kingdom of life. People often are intrigued, but how do you manage to study them? And it's easy to demystify this. First of all, we can mark every individual wasp with colored spots of paint in different parts of its body, so that every wasp has a name, and then we really begin to understand what's happening. So the wasps can be individually tagged and named. These wasps can be studied in nature wherever they occur. Fortunately, they like to live around human habitation. So I don't have to go very far. Often the wasps come and build nests in my office or in my home, so I can find them very, very easily. But it also turns out that you can quite easily bring them to the laboratory and simply move the nest at night, but allow them to fly in and out, then they will do their own thing very easily. For certain experiments, if we want, we can confine them maybe in a little plastic box or in a cage, and we can stack up many of these in my laboratory, which is called a vespiary. My laboratory does not have any walls. It has wire mesh screen all around it, which allows the wasp to fly in and out. And the size of the screen we have so adjusted to prevent a larger predatory wasp from entering. So that's the only artificiality of the situation. Otherwise, these are completely natural. Now, it turns out that there is a subtext to my talk. And the subtext is that the process of science is as important as the product. I think scientists often make the mistake of only selling the product and keeping the process hidden. This is not correct, because I think the process is more important. The product would be of interest to some people, but the process should be of interest to a much wider section of people, because you can use the same process in other places. Also, keeping the process hidden and flouting only the product actually creates a barrier between scientists and the public. And I think in order to democratize the process of science, we must discuss the process much more. So I'll try throughout this lecture to discuss the process, to tell you what we did, how we did, why we did, and I actually hope that you will be able to participate in the process of discovery, which I will try and describe here. So to say very briefly, research works in my group as follows. The third pillar of our research is passion. So I and my students are passionately interested in these wasps, and our primary occupation is to watch them. You mark the individual wasp and you watch them with no particular purpose in mind, just because it's a great fun to do that. But as you watch them, questions arise in your mind. Many of those questions are probably very hard to answer, at least in the beginning, but every now and then a question pops up which we think we can answer, at least by doing an experiment, if not otherwise. And then we try and design a scientific project to answer that question. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed. When we succeed and we think we have an answer, something very unusual happens. The answer is usually very unsettling or very unsatisfactory because it opens up another question for which we need to know the answer to be convinced that the first answer is correct. So one question leads to an answer, answer leads to the next question, and it continues in this fashion. I have therefore organized this lecture as a series of questions and answers. So I picked up a few questions and answers from our research, and I'll try and illustrate to you the way we work, the way we try to find out more about these wasps. So we have questions and we have answers. I already mentioned to you that the queen is like everybody else and she may be overthrown tomorrow. So the very first question that arose in our mind, how does the queen behave as compared to the workers? Does she really behave differently? And in order to answer this question, this was many years ago, what I decided to do is not to study the queen separately because she's like everybody else. So treat everybody as equal, and I found ways of measuring the proportion of time that each wasp spends in each of their behaviors. I made a list of all the things they do in plain English, and I calculated how much time each wasp spends in this behavior. So I had an animal by behavior matrix, the cells of the matrix containing the proportion of time spent in that behavior by that wasp, and I subjected this database to a multivariate statistical analysis followed by some pattern recognition, and I found that every wasp colony has three kinds of wasps. I call these behavioral castes. So we call them sitters, fighters, and foragers based on their major behavior that they perform. At this point we asked, where is the queen in this scheme of things? Now, common sense suggested to us that the queen must be in the fighter group. The individuals who do different behaviors in insect societies are called castes. And in ants, the castes are morphological, in bees, the castes are based on age, and here we call these behavioral castes. So where is the queen in this scheme of things? We expected the queen to be in the fighter caste because in other such species which had been studied, it had been shown that the queen is a particularly aggressive individual, and she uses physical aggression and harassment to control the workers, both to prevent the workers from becoming queens themselves, or at least delay the process, and also to make sure that the workers are honestly working and not just lazing away. So the queens must be fighters. To our great surprise, we found that our queens are not fighters. In colony after colony, we found that our queens are lazy sitters. The queen in this species is a non-aggressive, non-interactive, meek and docile sitter. So this is the answer, and to illustrate why this is unsettling, if this were true, if the queen is such a meek and docile sitter, how does she ever become a queen in the first place? Why do the workers accept her as their queen? So you can see that the answer is not, there's no time to party that you have got an answer. You have this question to answer. How is it possible? So we decided to design another experiment to find the answer to this question. And here we decided that we will actually witness the process by which an individual becomes a queen. We want to actually see that event. And the way to do that is to remove the queen. If you remove the queen, we know that one of the workers will become the queen, and we can actually witness this process. So we did an experiment over 3 days. On the first day, we studied all the wasps, the workers, and the queens. We had the data with us. Early next morning, we physically removed the queen and we studied the rest of the colony on day 2 in the absence of the queen. And when we did this experiment for the first time, at the end of day 2, we were wondering what to do with the queen. We had put her in a glass vial, we had given her some honey, and she was quite happy. So we said, let's put her back into the nest and see what happens. To our surprise, she went back to the nest as if nothing had happened and became a queen. So we studied on the 3rd day with the queen returned. And when we did this, the result was really quite spectacular. There is a small amount of aggression in this species, what we call a background aggression. Aggression here in the form of dominance-subordinate interactions. So one individual is behaviorally dominant. She may bite or chase another individual. We call her the dominant. And the one that is bitten or chased is called the subordinate individual. So there are dominant-subordinate interactions at a mild level. However, when we removed the queen, the whole colony became extremely aggressive. It became hyper-aggressive. The number of acts of dominant subordinate behavior per unit time in some cases doubled, 4 times, 5 times. We have a record of 40-fold increase in the level of aggression triggered simply by the removal of the queen. What is even more surprising, all of this aggression is by one worker. One worker becomes temporarily hyper-aggressive. So the data would look like this. If you, in the presence of the queen, almost nobody is showing dominance behavior, about 3-4 acts per hour. You remove the queen and one individual shoots up her level of aggression to about 40 acts per hour. Return the queen, she drops her aggression back. Now what would happen if you do not replace the queen? Then this individual would gradually drop her aggression and in fact would go on to become the next queen. But on the day she lays her first egg, she has no aggression. She has dropped all her aggression in order to become a meek and docile queen. So potential queens, we call these individuals potential queens, begin their careers as very aggressive individuals and only later become meek and docile. So that sort of answers the question, why do the workers accept her in the first place? But as you can see, this is not a very satisfactory answer because it begs the next question. How does a meek and docile queen inhibit workers from reproducing? Because she's only aggressive for a week and she may remain as the queen for months and sometimes close to a year. So throughout this period she is not aggressive. So how does she make sure workers do not challenge her and become queens? So here we suspected that the queen must be using a pheromone to do that rather than physical aggression. To study the pheromones, we designed a slightly more complicated experiment. This time we brought all the wasps, put them in a closed cage, and we studied all the individuals. By studied, I always mean determine the proportion of time each wasp spends in each behavior. And then instead of removing the queen, we actually we removed all the wasps from the nest. We took a blade and cut the nest in half and inserted a wire mesh in between. The purpose of the wire mesh was to allow volatile chemicals to go through, but the wasp not to go through. And then we introduced the wasp back randomly. We picked each wasp, tossed a coin, heads you go left, tails you go right. And after all the workers, finally we took the queen and we said heads you go left, tails you go right. And now we studied all of these individuals on both sides. On day 3, the equivalent of returning the queen, we picked the queen from wherever she was and moved her to the opposite side, leaving the workers as they are, and again studied all of them. Now the reason why we did this is we had the following predictions. If the queen pheromone is volatile, then both nest fragments should behave as if they have a queen. These wasps can smell this queen and nothing much should happen. But if the queen pheromone is non-volatile, then the queenless fragment should behave like a queenless colony, meaning there should be a hyper-aggressive individual who becomes a potential queen and goes on to become the next queen. And we've done this experiment. This has turned out to be a very, very interesting paradigm. We've done this experiment many, many times now. When this slide was made, we had already done it 24 times, and in every experiment, prediction 2 is upheld. This is what the data would look like. Day 1, nobody is aggressive. When you cut in half, one individual becomes aggressive on the queenless side. Move the queen to her side, she drops her aggression, and somebody else who was showing no aggression here suddenly shoots up her aggression. So within one day you can see that this individual. So the new queenless side now has a potential queen, and the new queen right side has reduced aggression. The previous day's potential queen goes back to work because the queen has returned. Ropalidia marginata, this is the name of the species, queens appear to use non-volatile pheromones to inhibit worker reproduction. And yet this begs the question, if the queen is such a meek and docile sitter, how does she regulate the non-reproductive activities of workers? This may allow her to prevent the workers from reproducing, but how does she make sure they work? Now I can imagine the queen produces a chemical which has a physiological effect on the workers to suppress their ovarian development and prevent them from reproducing. But you can't just produce a chemical and say, go and work. Why should the workers obey her? So in order to see how this might be done, we designed a different experiment. Now we removed the queen and we particularly focused on the non-reproductive activities of the workers. We picked 2 examples of work, bringing food to the nest and feeding the larvae. These are 2 of the most important things that the workers do. So we measured the rates at which these things are done in the presence of the queen and in the absence of the queen. And to our great surprise, we found that the workers don't seem to care. They don't need a queen. Rates at which food is brought, with the queen, without the queen, queen returned, makes no difference. Rate certificate larvae are fed with queen, without queen, queen return, makes no difference. So the workers simply don't care. Ropalidia marginata queens do not regulate their non-reproductive activity. The workers of their foragers. Then we asked, who does it? And in order to see who might regulate, we focus on this low level of dominant subordinate behavior that happens in a colony all the time, even in the presence of the queen. The queen doesn't show much aggression, but workers do a little bit of this to each other. They do a little bit of biting and chasing each other. What is the function of this kind of behavior? Now, actually our answer was that it is this worker dominance behavior which is used for the decentralized self-regulation of foraging by the workers. I'll give you a little bit of data to tell you how we arrived at this particular answer. First and foremost, we found that there is a weak but statistically significant positive correlation between the fraction of dominance received by an individual and her contribution to the work of the colony. So the more I get beaten up, the harder I work. So this already suggested that we might be on the right track. But this, of course, is a correlation, and you cannot draw causal inferences from correlation studies. You have to do experiments. So we designed two kinds of experiments. We said if this is true, then if nobody is hungry, there should be no more dominance behavior. And one of my students learned how to make the wasp not hungry. So she would actually take some food and with a forceps and offer it to the wasp. Initially they were a bit scared, but then they would take it, and she would offer some more, and they would distribute it among themselves, and she would continue to offer. They would feed the larvae with that food. Now everybody is satiated, and we predicted that there should be no more dominance behavior, and that's exactly what we found. Excess food reduces dominance behavior. So bringing food came down, feeding larvae came down, dominance behavior came down. In particular, the dominance received by the foragers came down. So foragers are particularly targeted for this dominance behavior, and that reduced when nobody is hungry. We also did the converse experiment. We starved everybody and said now the dominance behavior should go up. This was a little easier to do. We closed the doors of the cage and didn't feed them. And when we did that, we were actually able to show that starvation increases dominance behavior. Now one might think that if they are starved, they're in a bad mood, so they're fighting with each other. No. In fact, it is the foragers, the individuals who brought food yesterday, they were specifically targeted today when everybody was hungry. So we think that this dominance behavior is actually used for the decentralized bottom-up regulation of foraging by the workers. The queen doesn't have to do this anymore. Now one question which people often ask us, for a long time asked us when we discuss this, they say you remove the queen, one worker immediately becomes the potential queen and the next queen. Who is this lucky individual? How is it decided? As humans, we are very curious about how power is transferred one individual to the other. So who is the potential queen? Now it turns out that till today, we cannot predict the identity of the worker who will actually become the next queen. But she reveals herself within minutes after removing the queen. But until we remove the queen, we are not able to predict. So initially I used to say, no, it doesn't seem to be easy, we cannot say. And when this question persisted, I decided that we must do something about it. It's really embarrassing that we are not able to predict the potential queen, so we must do something serious about it. Now for a professor, do something serious means get a graduate student to work on this. So the next graduate student came to my lab. I told her, you have to predict the identity of the potential queen before removing the queen, and if you do so, you will get a PhD. She spent 5 years, did a whole lot of experiments. At the end of 5 years, she threw up her hand and said, no, I cannot predict. Well, she did many things, so we gave her a PhD all right, but she could not help us predict. She actually showed that the potential queens are exactly like all the workers. We cannot identify the potential queen in the presence of the queen. The potential queen is not unique by any criterion, not by her dominance rank in this low level of aggression, not even by her residual ovarian development, and not by any other behavior. So we really cannot predict. To this day, we cannot predict. And I have worked with this wasp for so long, I sort of feel kind of nice about it. There's something, there's still a secret that the wasps hold which they have not revealed to us. I have accepted this position. But the next student who came to the lab said, we don't know who the successor is. But do the wasps themselves know who their next successor is? Now initially we were told that this is not a scientific question. How can you know the mind of a wasp? How can you know what the wasps know and don't know? But this student was very persistent. So we spent a lot of time trying to see, can we design an experiment which allows us to answer this question scientifically? We tried out many designs. We actually did the experiment. We got the results, and then we knocked it down saying there's a flaw in this experiment. Ultimately, I think we came up with an experimental design which actually allows us to answer this question and answer this question in the affirmative. So the design looks complicated, but it's actually very simple. It's very hard to do the experiment. It's very easy to understand the experiment. So we went back. So question really we're asking is it possible that there's a hair designate, even though we cannot identify her? And do the other wasps actually know who this hair designate is? We went back to the design of the mesh experiment, where we cut a colony in half and insert a mesh in the middle. Now, the idea of this experiment is as follows. Let's assume that there is a hair designate. Let's assume that all the wasps know who they are designate. If this were true, what would be the consequence of this assumption in the experiment? So we cut the nest in half. We distribute half the wasps on one side, half on the other side. Now, just by chance alone, it might happen that the queen ended up on the left side, and the hair designate, so because we assume there is one, ended up on the opposite side, just by chance. Now here there should be no problem. This hair designate immediately starts behaving like a potential queen, because she cannot smell the queen on the side, and she's supposed to. But she is supposed to be the hair designate for the entire colony. So it's not enough if she does here. So we move her to the opposite side, we exchange the queen and her, and we say these wasps here should accept her as their potential queen. We move her back. Everywhere she should be accepted as the next potential queen. Only then we can say she is the hair designate for the entire colony. However, this situation can only occur in about half the experiments, because in the other half experiment, the unfortunate hair designate is sitting next to the queen and she can't do anything about it. The best possible individual here will become a potential queen, but this is the best possible individual only to her side. When I move her to the opposite side, there must be trouble. In fact, she should no longer be accepted, because this hair designate now, so she should not be, and this one should become a potential queen. But that's not the end of the story. The acid test for this individual is I move her to the opposite side, and she should be acceptable on both sides. This will happen in the other half experiment. So our summary predictions are the first potential queen should be unacceptable to the opposite side in about half the experiment, and a second one should emerge. But the second one should be acceptable to both sides. There should never be a third contender to the throne if you cut a nest in two halves. That's our prediction. These are tedious experiments, but this student had come up with this idea. She spent 2 years doing this experiment. She was able to do it 8 times. And in 3 out of 8 experiments, there was no second potential queen. There was only one individual which was successfully aggressive on both sides, not challenged by anybody. But in the remaining 5 experiments, the first individual had to drop her aggression, and a second one emerged, who of course was able to be on both sides. So in fact, the potential queen to emerge in about 50% of the cases, never a potential queen 3. Both predictions are upheld, and therefore we conclude that there is a hair designate known to the wasp. Now, it is remarkable that the potential queen 2 was never challenged. She did not receive a single act of aggression, even by the potential queen 1 or by any of the workers, either when she emerged on her side or when we moved her to the other side. And that's why we have confidence in the claim that the hair designate was obviously known and acceptable to all the wasps, including the potential queen 1. Now, this gave us a great satisfaction, gave us a great kick actually, because whenever people ask us, do you know who the next queen is, our answer was no. And now we were able to say, we don't still know, but we know that the wasps know. And I'm very grateful to the editor of Biology Letters of Royal Society for permitting me to keep this title. So we actually published a paper with the title, We Know That the Wasps Know, because there are cryptic successors to the queen in Ropalidia marginata. Now, the next student, so there is a hair designator. The next student came to the lab and said, how do you know that there's just one potential queen? Maybe there's a whole line of potential queens waiting for their turn. So I said, do the experiment. So he would go, remove the queen, immediately identify the potential queen. He would remove her and see if there's a second one. And he was able to do this. Is there just one hair designate, or there's a queue patiently awaiting their turn? Answer is yes. There's not just one. This is the queen. You remove her, one and only one individual becomes aggressive. Remove her, one and only one. Remove her, one and only one. After 5 potential queens, he said, I have given proof of principle. I don't have to continue any further. In fact, these potential queens are never challenged. The red bars are the dominance they show, and the blue are what they are supposed to receive, which is essentially 0. So nobody challenges them. There is a long reproductive queue of at least 5 potential queens. Perhaps the queue is even longer. Maybe everybody is standing in a line. Now, the question arises, if there is so much peace and order and cooperation, is there no conflict at all? Which is somewhat surprising. Now, we said there must be conflict, and we spent a lot of time trying to find conflict. We wanted to see a fight. We wanted them to fight inside the colony. So one of my students came up with the following idea. She asked, how does the queen maintain her status, and why does she sometimes lose it? Because queens do turn over in nature. After a while, the queen is overthrown somebody else. So she wanted to capture that moment. She said, I must prevent the queen from somehow showing that I'm a strong individual. We know that the queen rubs her pheromone on the surface of the nest. So she said, I will prevent the queen from rubbing her pheromone, and then the workers think that I'm sick or old or dead, and then there will be conflict. So what she did was she took all the wasps from a natural colony and put them in a laboratory cage. The queens and all the workers were transferred to a cage and deprived of their nest. The idea was now the queen has no nest, so she can't rub her pheromone. The queen frantically rubbed her pheromone all over the walls of the cage and therefore was not overthrown. But we said, if she is rubbing her pheromone all over the walls of the cage, that must be a very low concentration of pheromone. So there must be some effect of this, and there was. The workers actually attacked her. The queen continued to rub her abdomen on the walls of the cage and thus maintained her status, but the workers attacked her, which they never do in normal colonies. Even more interesting, and the queen retaliated, which she almost never does. So the queen is not incapable of showing aggression. When the need arises, she can use her aggression. Workers are not incapable of attacking the queen. When the need arises, they can actually attack the queen. So this is one idea of conflict. So there is potential of conflict, but the conflict is usually prevented from coming to the fore. The conflict is so well managed. One might ask, what about conflict with outsiders? That's where one would really expect conflict. How do the wasps treat wasps from other colonies? And this is where we found all the conflict we want to see. I'll give you just one experiment, or 2 experiments as an example. When the members of one colony were introduced into the cage, so there's a normal cage, a nest, a normal colony. We take all the wasps from another colony without their nest and simply introduce them. So there are resident wasps and there are alien wasps. When we did that, the result was really spectacular. Young alien workers were admitted freely into the colony. No problem, come and join. Old alien workers were allowed to live, but only away from the nest. As long as you're in the corner, that corner, I have no problem, but don't come anywhere near me. The alien queen was located wherever she was. She was physically dismembered. And what impresses me most about this, in addition to the conflict, is that the residents showed a very nuanced, differential treatment of them. Everybody was not treated equally. The young were treated differently, old were treated differently, and the queen was different. So the wasps are able to make all these assessments and then adjust their behavior accordingly. The fact that aliens were allowed to enter gave us a completely new way of doing experiments. Now we were able to take young individuals from faraway colonies, introduce them, and create genetically mixed colonies. And I'll give you just one example. We wanted to know what would happen to the aliens, young aliens who actually join. What happens to their fate? What is the fate of young accepted individuals? Young alien workers who are accepted into foreign colonies become completely integrated into their foster colonies and become normal workers and may even become future queens. The probability of an alien or foreign worker becoming a queen is directly proportional to the number of foreigners in the colony. So they have no disadvantage once they join, and I think this is what allows them to keep peace within the colony. They make war with outsiders, but they have complete peace within the colony. I come back to my title, Can We Understand an Insect Society? I await your verdict whether we have understood the insect societies, but why should we care? There are many reasons why people study insect societies. There are actually direct practical benefits. There are many benefits studying insect societies, including learning from them, including learning about communication. I know, for example, that France Telecom employs people who study ants in order to tell them how to route telephone traffic, internet traffic. There's a whole sub-branch of computer science called ant algorithms. So there are many practical reasons why people study. But remember, I said I study like an anthropologist. I certainly do not think that we should imitate animal societies blindly. That's very clear. However, I think they can hold a mirror to us and offer us a means to reflect on our own society and learn more about ourselves. We often need a mirror to see ourselves, and I think these insects, like many other animals, allow us to understand ourselves better, allow us to reflect. How do they behave? How do we behave? Why do we behave this way? And I think that is a great advantage of studying this. It only remains for me to thank the large number of very passionate students who work with me. I do not particularly like to work with big equipment, lots of money, lots of chemicals, big projects. I like to work with brains. And in fact, all my sophisticated instruments are on this slide. These are my passionate students, and I enjoy talking to them, debating with them, arguing with them, designing experiments, performing experiments, throwing them out, performing new experiments. That's the way research goes on. And of course, there is no end to this, because every time we answer a question, we have many other new questions. So this goes on. I have just picked a slice of the experiments to illustrate this to you, and I hope I have allowed you to participate in this process. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that very fascinating talk. It's exactly what I would have expected from the lecture I heard before. I'm sure there are questions, so Professor Gadagkar would be happy to answer a few questions. This one in the front here.
Where do the males come from and what do they do?
Could you use the microphone?
My question was relating to the males in the
Yes,
in the
I mentioned
colonies.
very briefly that the honeybee males are known to be lazy. These males are lazy too. In fact, the males are, of course, born in the same colonies, and they seem to hang around for about a week, probably to mature. And then they fly off and lead a nomadic life, attempting to mate with foragers from other colonies, and eventually die. They never come back to the nest. They are probably lazy. But I can't resist temptation to tell you that another student of mine came to the lab, and she said, I can't accept this. Why are the males lazy? In that 1 week, why don't they do some work? Why don't they feed the larvae? I won't give you the full details, but she not only understood why they were lazy, but she even cured them of their laziness.
If there's a queue for the potential queen, does that mean that the potential queen is older than the others? And could that explain why you have this different treatment
Yes.
when you
So
transfer?
when we were doing the queen removal experiments, our sample size was very small, and maybe that's the reason why we couldn't uncover what the sort of predictor is. But when we did this serial removal experiment, where we removed one after the other, we suddenly said we had a database of 100 potential queens, and we knew all about their behavior and body size and ovaries. So we put all of this in a generalized linear mixed model, and we tried to understand whether we could find something that will predict not only the potential queen, but her position in the queue. It turned out there was only one significant variable, and that was the age. But it's not as if the oldest becomes the next potential queen, because then we would be able to predict. It turns out age is a statistically significant predictor, but not a perfect predictor. To find out how perfect or imperfect it is, we did another experiment where we said we know the ages of all the individuals before we do the experiment, and we make a prediction who should be PQ1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We write it down. We actually go and do the experiment and find out who became PQ1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we ask, did the real potential queens bypass any legitimate individual which should have become because she's older? So we call this a queue jumping analysis, and we found out that 2/3 of the potential queens jump the queue, and on average an individual jumps over at least one older individual. So age is not always respected. It's a statistically significant predictor. So I think the statement we can make is the potential queen comes from amongst the older individuals. But there is still something else we are missing. We don't know which of the older individuals. It's not the oldest.
So are you optimistic about learning exactly how the queen's selected? I mean, you know the wasps know.
I would like to approach this asymptotically, so that the mystery goes on for a very long time. It's not the pheromone. We have checked that out. There's some question. Yes.
No, it's very interesting that the young alien wasps are accepted in your experiment. Does this happen in real life, as it were?
In real life, movement between wasps happens only when the recipient nest is very small. When a nest becomes very big and it's its only worker force, it doesn't usually get traffic and doesn't usually accept. But when the nest is young, this happens all the time. Yeah. They are accepting individuals.
I mean, I was just thinking whether there's some strange relationship or metaphor for what happens in monkeys, where the young monkeys often leave the troop and move to another one.
Yes. So here the young ones leave. They either start their own nest. Individual wasps can start their own nest all by themselves. Or they try to join other nests, but usually they join younger nests. And one interpretation of this is, see, every worker, I think, has a finite chance of becoming a queen in her own lifetime. So if you join a very big nest where there's already a long queue, it's probably not very worthwhile. So they like to join small nests where the queue is short. So this does happen in small nests.
I've got two very short questions, but thank you for a very interesting talk. The first is, sorry, I'm here.
Oh, yes, yes.
The first is, what happens if you increase the frequency at which you remove the queen? So you sort of say you do it by day. So what if you increase that frequency of removal? Does that alter?
Every hour. We have done it up to every hour.
Okay.
Well, we need to collect quantitative data on the frequency of dominance behavior to be certain who is the potential queen. Now, in order to do that, we need a little bit of time. So we have calculated that we need at least 30 minutes to be able to statistically identify as a unique individual in the colony. My suspicion is that it happens even sooner than 30 minutes, but to be sure, we need 30 minutes. So we remove the potential queen immediately after this, at most 60 minutes. So we have gone that close, but we can't go sooner than that because we don't know with confidence who the unique individual is. So it just takes as much time for us to find out, and then we're able to remove it. It happens immediately.
And just sort of following up from that, you did the principal component analysis of the different behaviours. So immediately after the queen is removed, do you see altered proportions of any of those behaviours?
That's very intriguing. Many years ago, I did this experiment, and what I find is that in a normal colony, if an individual is sitter, fighter, forager, they sort of remain in that role, except very young individuals. But older individuals, if you're a sitter, you're sort of sitter for a long time. But every time I remove the queen, that seems to be an opportunity for some reshuffling. So reshuffling happens in that short window when the queen has been removed. And then again, it sort of freezes for some time. So, here. Yes?
Hi. What's the advantage from a genetic perspective for the young alien workers to join a new colony with a queen that's maybe genetically unrelated to the young alien?
Well, that's their best hope, because if they become queens, then they have direct reproduction. Then they don't have to worry about relatedness to work. In fact, they would have unrelated workers helping them. So I think the quest, if I can use the metaphor, if we can use sort of human language, the quest for direct fitness has not disappeared. So it's not just indirect fitness. There is always a quest for direct fitness. Individuals can leave the nest of birth, go and start their own colonies all by themselves, get direct fitness. Go and join smaller colonies, become queens in the future, get direct fitness, or drive your mother away eventually and become the next queen. So there are multiple options available for direct fitness. And I like to think that in the meanwhile, until that actually happens, they're actually getting indirect fitness by helping relatives, except in the case of the alien workers. But in most other cases, that's true. Question here?
So have all the females mated, and when do they do it?
This is the funny thing. We've studied this at length, and we find that mating is somewhat irrelevant. First of all, if you take a colony, some of the workers are mated and some not, and we don't find a pattern. Because I think these foragers, when they go out for food, they sort of may get mated or may not get mated. It turns out that being mated is almost irrelevant. We have even found natural colonies which, at the time of study, the queen is unmated. She can lay haploid eggs, and then she will go and mate later on. So we have found that mating is unnecessary for individual to develop her ovaries, to lay mature viable eggs, haploid eggs, to compete with other mated individuals to become the sole egg layer and suppress mated individuals. And when we artificially put a mated and unmated individuals, there's a random chance of who will become the winner and the queen. So mating seems to be unnecessary. Mating is something that can happen afterwards. We've even seen individuals become queens, produce some males, then go out and mate, and then produce daughters. So mating seems to be particularly irrelevant sort of for the social life of the colonies, which is very useful for us because we can do a whole lot of experiments with virgin wasps. Very easy. You get the wasp close and you do experiments. So we do a whole lot of experiments with virgin wasps, confident that they have the whole full behavioral repertoire of mated individuals.
One last question.
You may have said this, I didn't hear, but if the queen, or if all the queen has to do to remain in her status is to rub her pheromones, then why would she ever lose power?
Because she first has to produce the pheromone before rubbing it, and that must be very costly too.
Okay.
That's what she eventually is not able to do.
Could we take one last question in the back?
Hi, thank you so much. Just a quick question then on, I guess, the order. You showed that there's a potential queen order.
Yes.
Is it possible that, and I'm trying not to use human emotive terms here, but do they ever get perturbed if there are always potential queens in front of them and they get to the point of old age and therefore death without ever having been queen? Is there equity within them and are they amicable with that?
I would think that actually most individuals die without ever becoming a queen. That is the more common fate of these individuals. And that's why we think that natural selection still favors their working altruistic behavior because they get indirect fitness. Most of the time they are working for close relatives, except the experimental introduction of aliens. But otherwise, the wasps in the colony are fairly closely related. So when an individual is working for someone else, she's getting what we call indirect fitness. And I think most of the individuals get. In honeybees, all workers only get indirect fitness. In ants, all workers only get indirect fitness. Here we think that although indirect fitness is the norm, several individuals can potentially also get direct fitness. And therefore we are seeing selection for that kind of a behavior.
Well, it's time now to thank Professor Gadagkar again for a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.